Good Wednesday to you. Wednesday is the day that we have Bible study, so we can set our calendars by it, which is great. And Tuesday morning is morning prayer, Thursday evening, evening prayer, and our Sunday worship. So as I've shared in many different places, all this will continue for the foreseeable future. I think we're going to be at this for some time. That's the way that I'm preparing. I hope I'm wrong. I'm always hopeful for a miracle. But until I see otherwise, I will look at what's before me and make the best decisions possible. So I have felt that providing these online resources has been very important for me and for all of us. And I want to promise you that I will continue it. And I've enjoyed it very much, although it has been very difficult to not get as much response back. Several of you have reached out to me, so thank you for that. But just speaking about being with people face to face, that immediate response that you have when you're talking. But that's just the way it's working right now. Okay, so Sunday will be the seventh Sunday after Pentecost. The readings are before you. First reading from Isaiah, chapter 44, Psalm 86. Second reading from Romans chapter 8, and Matthew's Gospel 13. Last week we had looked at Matthew's Gospel, and I was anticipating this week that we would jump back to the Romans passage. As I did share previously as well, I believe it would behoove all of us to spend time reading Romans over and over again. It is chock full of a lot of stuff and well worth our time. So today we're just going to be looking at a portion of the Romans passage, but a good one for sure. I am going to commend to you the reading of the Romans passage so I have as much time to cover what I wanted to cover. I trust you'll pause the video and read it. Okay, now we're back. You read it, and you understand everything, right? Well, sure you do. So today what I wanted to do was focus on verses 19 through 23 specifically. So just as I said, all of Romans, there's a lot to read, and then the lectionary picks out Romans 8, 12 through 25. I'm also going to narrow it down even more to looking specifically at 19 through 23. I've been reading some resources from the Christian Ethics at Baylor University. I've referenced that program before. They have an awful lot of different topics on the Christian life. And, I think all of us, we find resources that are helpful, so I have felt drawn to that. And it ties up pretty well because the topic that I was reading about moves into Romans chapter 8. So that's the way that it works with God. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple things and then have some comments as we have been doing. I'm going to read 19 through 23. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. One of the most profound New Testament expressions of God's plan for the natural world comes from these specific verses of 19 through 23 in Romans chapter 8. It powerfully depicts the end times expectation that the end of history, that God will reverse the damage from the fall not only to humanity, but even to nature itself. There is a popular misperception that the apocalypse is a world-denying and pessimistic view of the future. For the average person who uses the apocalypse, it brings to mind the end of the world. It is true that most early Jewish and Christian end times writings have this dualistic or two-age view of history. So this end times view that the present age or world is corrupted by sin and is in sharp contrast with the future perfect world or age of glory and righteousness. Furthermore, these end times writings, or the thoughts of the end times writings, they look forward to the eventual complete destruction of the material world, rather than this eschatological perfection and liberation from the damage caused by sin. So an awful lot of the apocalypse, when we think about Revelation in particular, it's this complete destruction of the material world, right? And then the next life will be completely different from the present life, which is not true, at least as we're going to be studying in Paul today. One of the major takeaways that I want you to know, and I'll be reiterating this over and over again, is that, at least according to Paul, the apocalypse, the end times, brings not only the destruction, but it brings the liberation and transformation of the things of the present reality, right? So as I've shared with kids, and again, I could be wrong about this, right? Because I've not died and I don't know what heaven looks like, right? But I'm just presenting to you in my reading and study what I believe this afterlife, to be. And I share it with the deepest sense of humility and admission that I don't know 100%. But in my faith life, in my studying, that the afterlife is again a transformation. This apocalypse brings into the renewal of the heaven and earth. It's this merger back together of things that are separate. So rather than just being up in the clouds with angel wings, at least in Paul's view, our bodies are transformed into these new, healthy, beautiful bodies that God has always intended. So we're not separate, but we're actually merged, unified, right? So physicality, what we know, will not go away, but it will be transformed. And that's a really amazing sort of thought. So let's discuss a little bit how we get to that point. And again, I'll be coming back to that. In Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 23, the Apostle Paul reflects the end times perspective similar to the stream of Jewish end times writings. He looks forward to the permanent eschatological transformation of creation when Christ returns. The damage that the fall caused to nature will be reversed, and nature will be perfected, so that it shares in the glory of the resurrected children of God. Although this passage is part of the letter rather than the end times like the book of Revelation writing, nevertheless, this worldview, the theology, and many expressions are very similar to those of the Jewish end times writings from the very same period. It is one of the clearest expressions of the apocalyptic triumph of God. The apocalyptic perspective emphasizes the hope in the dawning victory of God and the imminent redemption of the created order, which has inaugurated in Christ. Okay, so Paul develops two themes to get to this point. The present corruption of nature is the result of the fall of Adam and Eve, and the eschatological redemption of nature will free it from corruption and transform it to the freedom and glory. Now again, that's where that transformation comes in. Not like completely doing away with the old, destroying what we know, right, forever, but to transform it, which would mean that if there's the transformation of the body, these heavenly bodies, that there's also the transformation of what God created, all of creation, okay, the world. So again, when this apocalypse comes, it's this heaven and earth. We're not just up there floating around, but it's a transformation of all the things of which that we've lived in, that we are familiar with. But now we could see clearly we're not walking around, as Paul says, within his letter to the Corinthians, seeing dimly. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to make sure that we had covered. The reason that Adam's sin affected nature and brought it to this corruption is that God gave humanity dominion over nature. Okay, so just as Adam falls away, is broken in sin, Adam and Eve have been given dominion over nature, and so by default that means that nature is also broken. It is also sinful. Since Adam was accountable to God to rule the earth and to tend the garden as the vice-regent under God, Adam's sin affected the natural world for which he was responsible. Thus, nature became frustrated in its purposes and can no longer be all that it was created to be. Yet Paul describes the suffering of the natural world in the context of the great eschatological hope for the believers of nature. Now, that word eschatological is, again, it is a word speaking of the end times, but eschatology is referenced again through the life, ministry, death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. So those things were for a reason. As Luke in his gospel uses this word day, it is necessary. It was necessary. That's part of that cosmic salvation plan. So when we use that word eschatology, it is a faith word. It's not just blowing everything up, as I think it's used, but it is a transformation of the things that are broken. And I ask you to read the book of Revelation that way as well. I know most times it's this gloom and doom book, but when you really read it through the ends of this eschatological hope, then it really takes on a different form. And one other thing, this has always been a pet peeve of mine. I'm sorry about this. But whenever I hear somebody say the book Revelation, I often hear people say the book Revelations. Just notice that. And it's surprising, some of the people who say that. It's only one revelation, not revelations, meaning that there's multiple. Okay, so that makes me feel better. Thank you for my therapy session here today. Now, for moms in particular, I thank God every day that I'm a guy, because I never had to give birth. I'm convinced that God wisely selected women to give birth because women are way stronger than men. If it was up to men to give birth, it wouldn't happen, right, guys? So a shout out in gratitude to the strength of women. Paul uses just an incredible metaphor about the world and where we find ourselves today. Really helpful. He says that the whole creation, which we're part of creation, has been groaning in labor pains until now. So the suffering of creation is like birth pangs leading to a glorious new world, rather than the death pangs of a dying creation. Throughout Scripture, the metaphor of birth pangs points to an intense and prolonged pain that leads to a joyous and positive outcome. What a great image as we find ourselves in this pandemic. Women, birth pangs, they last. I've heard of women in labor for 48 hours. I just couldn't even imagine. So all of that struggle, right? And then what happens is the birth happens, and you've seen it in your own life if you're a dad and you were there. That when the baby is born, there is that joy, there's that release. And not that I have to ask women this, but I don't think the women ever forget about the pain, right? But the pain is changed because of the joy that is experienced. I really love the idea that everything, and again, I don't know this for sure, but this is where I'm at, that there's much more power in our lives being transformed rather than just blown apart and started anew. And here's why. Because we are going to be able, I believe, I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to remember everything from this life, the joys, the burdens, the struggles, right? We're going to have knowledge of the relationships that we've had in this life. It's not going to be a new life that we have to start again, and we suddenly look at this person that we've known here, and then, hey, who are you? Oh, you're Larry. No, we're going to intimately know them. And that way, remembering the burdens and the struggles, when everything is transformed, that makes that transformation all the more powerful, because we can appreciate where it is that we came from. So I really find great joy and peace in believing that. That's where I'm at. I think I can back that up. But it really jives an awful lot with where I find myself and who God is. Okay. So hold on to that image. When you're getting frustrated with the world, look at this phase, even though it's lasting a long time. Look at this phase of life as labor pains. And although there's moments of calm in the labor, the pains come back on, but there is a release. There will be an end. And we will be all the more grateful for that new birth and redemption. Thus, the redemption that Christ brings will have cosmic consequences. And this is another really important part. At the second coming of Christ, when God's people are resurrected and glorified, the natural order will be restored to its proper operation, so that it fulfills the purpose for which it was created. This passage, as I've shared before, strongly suggests that God will transform the existing creation rather than create a brand new world from scratch. When Paul says, and I quote, "The creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay," in verse 21, the phrase, "the creation itself," could be translated more literally as "this creation." The resurrection of the bodies of believers is a part of this perfection of nature, for which both the material creation and believers, and I quote, "wait eagerly." That's in verses 19 and 23. And also, if you go to look at Philippians chapter 3, verse 21. Paul's vision for redemption has a cosmic scope and is not limited merely to salvation of individual humans or even to the church as the new community of the redeemed humanity. Another point that I know I've shared many times before, but often salvation is portrayed as this individual thing that I get. Are you saved? And so I'm concerned about my salvation. Well, that doesn't really jive up with Paul's end times vision. Salvation is a cosmic consequence, is a cosmic result. So it'd be we are saved. Now, that's another helpful way, I think, and again, I'm going out on a limb a little bit here, and I could be wrong about this, but this is where I'm at. When we start to kind of say who's in and who's out, right? This sort of salvation business, this thing that's been going on with religions, these sort of competing religions. Well, what if we looked at it as salvation, again, as a gift that comes from God through Jesus Christ, is this cosmic renewal? Now, I'm going to lay my cards here on the table as well from the safety of my office. I really want you to know where my position is. I believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. But my position is that it's more of a cosmic through Jesus salvation, right? That whatever happens in this life, I think in the next life, there's always the arms of Jesus will always be open. And so whether people acknowledge Jesus or loved him or whatever, for many different reasons in this life, I think those gates are always going to be open. There are some that would hold to the position that all religions are a path towards God. I can certainly understand, that position. All religions authentically talked to the reality of two things: loving God and loving neighbor as yourself. Okay, so I am there. But I do, in the most loving and big tent way, hold that salvation comes to the world, through the cosmos, to all of us, whether we're in it or whether we're in the plan or not, or on the team or not, that it's going to be just coming our way. It's like this, sometimes you see like a dust storm kind of, it just, I mean, we're all there, we're just going to be caught up in it. And I think on the other end of it, there's Jesus just looking down in this posture of love. And I think when all of us are able to not see dimly anymore, when everything has been lifted, when the apocalypse comes, we're going to see, not even see, but we're all going to just be enveloped in this love that no one is going to be able to resist. It's going to be overpowering. These types of ways that I have developed through my reading and prayer life, often people say, well, does theology really matter to one's day-and-day life? Well, yeah, theology, philosophy, all these things are ways in which that we can live in a broken world with reality, with honesty, with acknowledging our part in the brokenness, but also live it in hope. And then when I see someone that I am angry at or burdened against or considering to put in the side of the other, this theology allows me to say, well, you know what? I'm probably going to be right next to them in this transformed afterlife. And it's really helpful, really, really helpful. So I'm giving way too much. It's like a speech here. I don't know. I apologize if this is too much, but I just feel very passionate about this, very strongly about our deeper understanding as Christians of what this Jesus business really means. And I think, and I'll move on, it's really been camped in a very small way. Jesus is about my individual salvation for a small group of people. I really look at it as salvation is a cosmic transformation for all people. And I don't understand how people could be negative about that. And maybe it's this sort of sense of, well, I acted honorably and I went to church every Sunday and this whole, I did all this, and why should somebody who never acknowledged Jesus in this life be then welcomed into this kingdom? That's not fair. Well, go back, go read these parables that Jesus talks about fairness. It's not about fairness, about, the workers, the ones who show up last, right? And the ones who worked all day. How does that work out? Yeah, they're all given, given the same. And the early ones say, oh, that's not fair. Well, I'm asking us in those moments to not consider the fairness, but to be thankful for the ones who showed up late that are now invited into this banquet. That's what gospel is about. It's good news, people. It's good news, for goodness sakes. Yeah. Okay. So what does all this mean, right? So let's, in the last couple minutes, kind of say what does all this mean? Partially it means that we are to be living, of course, within the world. That the world is not something to be simply discarded, right? Just heaven, looking up heavenward. that the future is just up there. Well, no, as we hear apocalypse, the future is here. It's this merger of heaven and earth, right? And so the earth, the body, these are good things. These are not, bad things unto themselves. The bad things are the broken parts of us, not the body and the earth itself. Adam, again, was to keep the garden. He was to guard the garden. This suggests that part of the human dominion over the earth is to make that the natural world does not suffer harm, at least. This means that humans should not cause harm to nature. I mean, God created this, so we are given dominion over it. We are to care for it. We can't save it, the way that Jesus will transform it, right? But we can certainly do the things that we know that are good for the creation. So rather than our heads up, we look around us, and what can we do to be caring for what God has gifted us with? So that we should act in ways that anticipate this new creation. Paul's teachings in this passage also imply that human beings have this solidarity with nature. Both believers and nature groan together as we long to be set free from the consequences of sin. That's in Romans 22 through 23, chapter 8. This solidarity is an inescapable consequence of the dominion God gave humans over nature. Thus, when human beings sin, the natural world for which humans have responsibility is negatively impacted. So the solidarity of humanity with nature also stems from the fact that humans have material bodies. People groan along with nature because their physical bodies are in bondage to decay, even as is the rest of all of the material creation. So, this time that we spent studying these just 4 verses suggests, I think, to all of us that the church, I believe, needs to continue to broaden its understanding of the redemption of Christ, that it is a cosmic event. It is big time. It is God's plan for redemption is not just for individual human souls or even the corporate redemption of a new community, although these are essential parts of redemption, but the apocalyptic worldview stresses that God plans to restore the whole creation to its proper operation, which was lost when the first humans disobeyed God. And I quote, to wrap up, "Through him, Christ, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of the cross." That's Colossians 1:20. Since God's plan for redemption is cosmic, as believers grow more like Christ, their actions should have a positive impact not only on other people, but also on the whole of God's creation. God's priority is on redemption. It is about restoring right relationships with us in creation to God. And that is a very hopeful and glorious statement for today. All right, so I wish you well. This has been a good study, and peace be with you.